Hello, good evening. This is my oral presentation final on the Gothic for Gothic literature class. So, to get started, the Gothic literature genre holds a lot of value in society and everyday life. It's a really important genre to study as it can help us understand issues in our own society and, pardon, relationships as people within society. And it can help us understand our past and how that has affected our world today and why things are the way they are today. And the genre also holds a lot of raw emotions that authors feel about life that are discovered by readers and by critics upon the analyzation of Gothic works. So, being introduced to the Gothic, prior to the course, I had some misconceptions that seem to be very common misconceptions about the genre, such as just like horror and gore, like a lack of meaning or simply meant to scare a person or make someone uncomfortable. Like, I know me personally, like, I was never really into the Gothic or anything scary of that nature. So I had a lot of misconceptions about the genre that a lot of people seem to have. Um, so learning the genre, the course was very eye-opening in this aspect. Covering the influences and the meaning of the Gothic, it was very eye-opening because it gave a meaning to the genre. Like I know, hearing about like Edgar Allan Poe and like Stephen King was really popular when I was in like junior high with some of my friends, and I was never really into it. I just kind of thought it was supposed to be scary and kind of gross, and I was like this Poe guy and Stephen King, like they're just kind of weird people. Like how does one come up with such a weird, dark, gory, decaying kind of concept? Um, so there's influences in the meaning of the Gothic. We have the why, the influences, and then there's a big part of the patriarchy and cultural turmoil within the Gothic. So the why, um, many upon being introduced to the Gothic ask the question of why. Like, why do authors write in this style? Why is it so dark? Why do they choose to reference the themes that they use? Why does it feel like they're trying to scare people? And this is kind of goes to show why it is so important to talk about the Gothic. It honestly is a very under explored genre of literature. And so this is kind of why it's very important because it is very misunderstood and a lot of people tend to think that it's just scary and weird and gross when really it's a really important genre to understand society and relationships between people in the world and how events in the world and things like that can affect people day-to-day life. So the answer lies within the influences of the Gothic genre. So the influences, right? We covered elements and influences of the genre, being fueled by cultural turmoil. A woman named Maggie Kilgore states the Gothic is part of the reaction against the political, social, scientific, industrial, epistemological revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, which enabled the rise of the middle class. Right? So here we kind of see people, they're trying to speak out against things that they think are oppressive or they're questioning morality. The 17th, 18th centuries, kind of when people start to question the Catholic Church and things like that. Um, and really, that was just kind of not a safe thing to do. There were a lot of contemporary issues within our society, and people needed a safe way to express that. And that's kind of where you see Gothic literature kind of start and kind of take off. Um, so pressure from patriarchal issues and cultural turmoil typically have a direct effect on authors that lead them to write their works. So we see that obviously in the last slide talking about the 17th and 18th century where the genre kind of starts. And then we see it even then in modern aspects. So I reference Argentine author Mariana Enriquez. I've worked with her pieces in a paper that I wrote for this course. And she lived through a very brutal dictatorship in Argentina where people were disappearing and people were being murdered. And that living through that, it's very clear that that led and influenced her publication of The Little Angel's Exhumation, which is filled with a lot of elements such as decay and terror. And when you really analyze it, you can see the connection between that event and the writing of the piece. And so decay being kind of a big factor of the story, decay as an element represents social collapse, which there was social collapse within the dictatorship. Things were falling apart. Things still aren't right today in Argentina. They're still finding these people that supposedly disappeared or were snatched off the street. So it represents that social collapse. And so there's physical decay, with the supernatural elements and, the ghosts and the dead that we see in the Gothic. But decay is also symbolic as well. So the relevance, right? Gothic literature it's full of intense emotions. It's a lot of people know that it's full of death, but really the Gothic kind of shows us, like through characters and through literary devices, how death can really change a person, and that's how it is relevant in my own life, right? Because as a child, I didn't have a whole lot of, I was a very unsocial child. I was a very awkward child. So really my only friends were kind of like my parents and then my uncle and my grandmother who had passed away in a span of just a couple years. They passed away very close apart. And so this traumatic loss to me led to social isolation, which is another thing that we see in Gothic literature. And at the time, I felt like I had lost two of my best friends, and I struggled to make new ones at such a young age, because it's a developmental age, which you can kind of see too in The Little Angel's Exhumation, where the narrator starts experiencing these weird traumatic events with finding bones and remains in the yard. And so I struggle to make friends at a new age, and at that age, it's very influential. And in the end, the experience taught me how to move on and let go of things outside of my control. And that's kind of also another thing that tends to happen in the Gothic is when you let go of things that are outside of your control, if you just kind of relax, calm down, and if something is out of your control, that's kind of when we see a resolve. But it's also too like if people don't let go, then we don't see that resolve. And social isolation is prevalent in Gothic literature that the characters have to overcome in order to solve the conflict they're fighting in the story. So the humanities. Contemporary society is how we as people live together and our relationships together and how we live together with social and political influence. And we can either be banded together and we can be brought together as a community, or we can be pushed apart like contemporary issues like political tensions and other things listed by Chris Drew. Um, Humanities courses such as Gothic literature shows how much we, according to David Narr, rely on each other in difficult times in our world as authors tend to write to reach an affected audience and to inspire, right? Because there's always a target audience when an author writes a piece. And usually Gothic writers, they tend to appeal to people who have been hurt and who have been put through these traumatic experiences. And so that's kind of where the Gothic kind of really touches the humanities in contemporary society. And humanities give people themes and ideas that they can relate to or use discussions to reflect their experiences in the contemporary world. Um, so we talk about social issues in the humanities courses, and it gives people a space to where they can talk about their own experience. And it's really prevalent in contemporary society because there's so many societal issues that sometimes it gets kind of scary to talk about because people they butt heads, they don't get along, they disagree. But the humanities kind of give a safe environment to where it can be discussed and be educational and it can be an educational debate, but people are always very kind to one another and allow other people to share their opinions. And that is where the humanities is really important. That's where contemporary society and the humanities courses, they're very important. And these are my works cited. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I had a great time taking Gothic literature. Um, so that's all for me. Thank you.